Welcome into the show today. Thank you for making this podcast a part of your day and for going on this podcasting journey with me. If you're watching this show on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please rate, review, and follow this show wherever you are listening to this show. The podcast has really gone on an incredible journey in the last year. Almost 4,000 subscribers, doing a podcast 6 times a week about the Minnesota Vikings, and the downloads and listens and follows and comments have been incredible across all social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So thank you for being a part of this journey and for making this podcast a part of your day. It's pretty fun. This podcast is 100% honest, 100% of the time, and it doesn't really care about your feelings. And right now I'm kind of battling something internally, because before this show started, I really had to poop. And right now, I still kind of have to poop, but I'm trying to make it through the show first so I can put it together while I'm pooping. And then I can go to Bible study afterwards. So that's my plan for the morning. That's my plan of attack. And hopefully I can make it through this podcast as good as normal. My takes are fresh. I'm feeling good. And I'm battling controversy. But right now, when you have adversity, not controversy, you can fight through it and you're just stronger afterwards. So that's my plan, and that's my plan of attack. Kevin O'Connell signed a contract extension with the Minnesota Vikings, and it's reportedly around $15 million a year. And it makes sense from a few different angles. One, it makes sense to sign a contract extension after you figured out what Ben Johnson made from the Chicago Bears. Maybe it had nothing to do with it, but maybe it did. When Ben Johnson chose his location, because let's just be real about it, he basically had his free choice on where he wanted to coach. I'm sure he had multiple offers from multiple teams to come in and be their head coach, and he got the free choice, which hardly any NFL head coaches get, and he chose the Chicago Bears over the Raiders, over the Jets, over the Jaguars, which makes sense. It's the toughest division in football, but tough divisions change so frequently, and that's not a decision that should really hold you back, because just a few years ago, the toughest division in football was the NFC West with the Seahawks and the 49ers and the Cardinals and the Rams. That was considered the best division in football. Then it switched, and then became the NFC North. And the tough division in football thing changes every year or every other year. So it's not a decision that you should base your head coaching decision on. But the most important decision is who or which team has their quarterback in place. And he chose the Chicago Bears because Caleb Williams clearly has talent. It needs to be figured out, and his potential needs to be exploited more than it was when Matt Eberflus or Thomas Brown was their head coach. And Ben Johnson believes that he can be that guy that does that. But it makes sense that Kevin O'Connell signed it afterwards, because what you don't want is you sign your contract extension, you get $10 million a year, and then you find out that Ben Johnson gets $13 million a year his first year as a head coach. That doesn't make sense, and that wouldn't make sense for anybody. So it made sense that Kevin O'Connell waited to see what the market was for guys like Ben Johnson. But as he's signed this contract extension, and as you look towards next year and the year after for the Minnesota Vikings, Kevin O'Connell now enters a dangerous territory, because when he signed on to be the Vikings head coach a couple of years ago, his roster was what it was, and they didn't have much control over it. They entered a situation with terrible cap, contracts that were awful defensively and offensively, guys that were paid way too much money for their age, and it was a disaster of a situation, and they made the most of it. They went 13-4. Kirk Cousins had one of his best years of his career, and they made it to the playoffs when it was not necessarily expected. His second year, it was what it was. They started out terribly 0-3, but then they went on a hot run, and Kirk Cousins was playing somewhat like an MVP candidate mid-season until he tore his Achilles. Season's over after that. But it really wasn't, because Josh Dobbs came in. We had the Dobbs sanity thing going for a while. And at one point, the Vikings had an 80% chance of making the playoffs. But then Dobbs' sanity went away, and he reverted back to what he had been throughout his entire NFL career. And Mullins and Dobbs and Jaron Hall, just not going to cut it late in the season when games really, really matter. So you can't really blame Kevin O'Connell for that one. And this year, projected to win 6.5 games, takes Sam Darnold to 14 wins and makes him an MVP candidate until the final week of the year, in which he was a disaster versus the Detroit Lions. So there's been a theme in Kevin O'Connell's first 3 years in the NFL. He's taken a team that has not had much expectation, and he's made the most of it. Let's just be real about that. His first year with Kirk Cousins, no one expected the team would win 13 games. His second year was a wash. Injuries deflated the entire year at the most important position in football. And then this past season, no one expected the Vikings to win 14 games. But now it switches, because now Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi have full reign and full control over the Minnesota Vikings roster. There's not this Kirk Cousins dead cap thing roaming through the Minnesota Vikings organization. There's not a contract here or contract there to a 30-something-year-old guy that is completely ruining the salary cap flexibility moving forward. The Minnesota Vikings have free agency money to spend. They have their QB1 in place, J.J. McCarthy, whom they practically hand-selected. I mean, if they could have hand-selected anybody, they would have picked Jaden Daniels or Drake May. But they also picked McCarthy over Bo Nix, and they would have taken McCarthy over Penix if Penix was available. So they hand-selected McCarthy, and they have room to spend on offensive linemen, on defensive guys, and now the expectation changes. The expectation changes from, okay, Vikings, just be decent. And that was the expectation. Okay, Kirk Cousins, you're a 500 guy throughout your entire career. Maybe the Vikings can go 9-8 or 10-6 or whatever the situation was. Maybe the Minnesota Vikings this season can sneak out 8 wins and potentially compete for a wild card spot. And I think that it is way more easy to win when there's not as much pressure. And that's what Kevin O'Connell had in his first 3 seasons as head coach for the Minnesota Vikings. There was not much pressure to perform great. I think it's easier to take a team that's supposed to be average and take them good than it is to take a team that's expected to be good and make them good or even make them great. Because now the expectations are shifting. There's no thing laying over the Minnesota Vikings organization preventing them from being good. It's all about execution. Excuses are out the window. And that's why Kevin O'Connell now enters a dangerous territory of expectations shifting. There's a lot more pressure to deliver playoff wins and maybe even a Super Bowl, because there's no Sam Darnold at quarterback 1 anymore, or most likely not. Kirk Cousins, 35 years old, never really had success in his career. That's not hanging over your head either. It's up to you now to make the most of the roster that you personally constructed. So, yeah, things are about to change. Expectations are changing by the minute. And if Kevin O'Connell cannot prove himself to be a coach that can take McCarthy this first season and make him a good quarterback and make the Vikings a competitive team in the NFC North, he's going to be on the hot seat immediately. So now that guys are gone and the roster is reconstructing and shifting, and they have full power over who stays, who goes, who's drafted, and there's not this dead cat hanging over their heads, the Minnesota Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell has a lot of pressure. And he's proven to be a good coach for the Vikings. I don't think he's necessarily as respected as he should be through his first 3 seasons on the Vikings. Kevin O'Connell has a win percentage of .667 and is 4th among active head coaches. Oh, but he lost a playoff game with Sam Darnold. Oh, but he lost to Daniel Jones with an Ed Donatel defense. I think right now we give him a pass because of those 2 situations that were hanging over his head at that time. Ed Donatel's defense, Sam Darnold at QB1. But now those things are gone. Brian Flores is going to be back. They have the money to spend. They still have a first-round draft pick. And they have McCarthy, who looks like he's on schedule to be back for OTAs, training camp, preseason, and the regular season next year. So things are a-changing, and things are moving fast within the Minnesota Vikings organization because now there's pressure. The over one,
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
The over-under win percentage of, 6.5, and even if the Vikings won 10 games with Sam Darnold, people would have been impressed with Kevin O'Connell. Then they win 14. Well, that's not going to be the over-under win percentage next year. The over-under win projection next year is probably going to be like 8.5, maybe even 9.5. And you better get there. You better outperform those expectations, or the brigade of Minnesota Vikings sports fans are going to come charging at the TCO Performance Facility, and they're going to be pissed because this was supposed to be your time to shine with McCarthy and Jefferson and Addison and the defense and a roster that you completely constructed yourself. Excuses are gone, and that is dangerous territory for Kevin O'Connell. Again, it's way harder to take a team that's expected to be good or great and make them great than it is to take a team that's supposed to be average and make them good. It's way harder. Think about McCarthy this year from the Cowboys. The Cowboys stunk with Dak Prescott. And I was like, fire McCarthy, this guy sucks. Oh, what a terrible head coach. Like, why is he the Dallas Cowboys coach? Why did Jerry Jones pick him? Dak Prescott goes down. Cooper Rush steps in. Cowboys start winning games. And then all of a sudden people are thinking, wow, McCarthy can coach. This guy can take bottomless talent in the NFL and make them a competitive roster. And the Dallas Cowboys won how many games this year with Dak Prescott hurt? And now we're seeing it in the market. Interviewed with the Bears, interviewed with the Saints. Now he's getting serious interviews in the NFL. Wouldn't have happened if Dak Prescott was healthy and the Cowboys still stink. Expectations are a dangerous thing. And now Minnesota Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell now enters a dangerous territory. I made it through the podcast. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making this podcast part of your day. Tell your friends, hit that subscribe button wherever you're watching and listening.